The hum of the Aetheria was a constant companion, a low, thrumming vibration that resonated through the deck plates and into the soles of my boots. I stood at the main viewport of the observation deck, my gaze fixed on the velvet blackness punctuated by distant, indifferent stars. For weeks, this view had been my world, a canvas of cosmic indifference stretching beyond the ship's hull. My name is Reid Chen, and I am a xenogeologist. My life's work has been the meticulous study of what lies beyond, the unique mineralogies born in the deep void, but nothing I'd ever encountered had prepared me for Xylos-7. The mission was simple on paper: retrieve samples from a newly discovered rogue planetoid, designated Xylos-7. The corporation funding this expedition had promised unprecedented discoveries, a bounty of exotic matter that would redefine energy production. For me, it was the ultimate frontier, a chance to touch the untouched, to decipher the geological secrets of a world that had drifted through the interstellar medium for millennia, unburdened by a sun. I prided myself on my rationality, my ability to dissect and categorize the universe's most arcane formations. My instruments were extensions of my mind, precise and unwavering. I trusted data above all else. We were close now. The Aetheria had begun its final approach, the distant pinpoint of Xylos-7 growing steadily larger, resolving from a mere smudge into a discernible, if still alien, sphere. It wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, a mottled gray, scarred by ancient impacts, devoid of atmosphere or light. Yet a strange, almost magnetic pull emanated from it, a whisper across the immense distances. "Readings are still fluctuating, Reid." A voice crackled over my comms, belonging to the navigation officer. "Gravitational fields are unusual, and the energy signatures are off the charts, but also unstable." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "Keep the primary shields at maximum. I want a full spectral analysis running constantly. Every anomaly, no matter how minor, needs to be logged." My voice was steady, betraying none of the subtle tremor that had begun to snake through my gut. This wasn't standard. Rogue planetoids were often gravitationally dense, but these readings were erratic, spiking and then flatlining in ways that defied known physics. It was like watching a heart monitor skip beats, then flatline, then burst into a frantic rhythm, all within seconds. I turned from the viewport, crossing the observation deck to my personal console. Holographic readouts shimmered before me, displaying complex datasets in a dizzying array of colors and symbols. The ship's main sensors were screaming. What the navigation officer called unusual was, in fact, unprecedented. Gravity wells shifted like sand dunes, pulling and pushing the ship with phantom hands. Energy readings from Xylos-7 pulsed with an intensity that overloaded our standard filters, yet the source remained elusive, a diffuse field rather than a point emission. My fingers flew across the console, adjusting parameters, cross-referencing data streams. I wanted to rationalize it, to find the logical explanation. Perhaps an incredibly dense core interacting with peculiar mineral deposits, or some hitherto unknown phenomenon of interstellar drift. My mind, usually a fortress of logic, felt a hairline crack begin to form. Then it happened. Not a sound, not a tremor in the deck, but a sudden, jarring shift in my perception. In their place, I was standing, not in the Aetheria's observation deck, but somewhere else entirely. The air was thick with the scent of sun-baked earth and something metallic, like ancient dust and exposed ore. The ground beneath my feet was rough, cracked red clay. Above, the sky bled from a bruised purple to a fading orange, the last vestiges of a dying sun dipping below jagged ochre cliffs. The silence was profound, broken only by the rasp of the wind. My breath caught in my throat. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the sudden alien stillness. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the vision away, telling myself it was a stress-induced hallucination, a trick of the light, the overwhelming data finally catching up to me. When I opened them again, the console was back, its holographic displays still flashing their impossible numbers. The hum of the Aetheria was steady once more. My hands, I noticed, were trembling slightly. I gripped the edge of the console, forcing myself to breathe, to push the image of the canyon from my mind. It was nothing, just a momentary lapse, fatigue, and the data before me remained stubbornly illogical, pointing towards a world that defied understanding. Xylos-7 was not merely a rock in space. It was a riddle wrapped in an enigma, its very presence an affront to the ordered universe I had always known. The tension in the observation deck was palpable now, mirroring the strange, unseen forces emanating from the world ahead. My gut tremor was a whisper then, but it grew into a roar as the Aetheria's primary drill bored deeper. The console before me displayed a relentless flood of geological data, each parameter meticulously tracked. Pressure, temperature, material density, everything screamed standard deep core extraction. But I knew better. The subtle energy fluctuations, the phantom echoes on the long-range scanners, they were anomalies that defied the expedition's official geological models. We're approaching the target depth. Reid, the lead driller's voice crackled through my comms, laced with a professional calm I envied. 30 meters to estimated core breach. I leaned closer to the main screen, my fingers hovering over the holographic controls. The drill bit, a marvel of hyperalloy engineering, was chewing through the planetoid's mantle at an incredible rate. My xenogeology specialization told me we should be hitting a dense, metallic core. My gut told me we were about to find something else entirely. Maintain trajectory, no deviations, I instructed, my voice flat. Prepare for immediate retraction if any structural integrity warnings appear. The seconds stretched, thick and heavy. The low thrum of the Aetheria was a constant companion, a vibration through the deck plates and into my bones. Then a sudden, jarring spike on the pressure sensors. Not a structural collapse, but something else, a resistance that wasn't geological. The drill's progress meter stuttered, then froze. Breach detected. The driller shouted, a note of surprise in his tone. But it's not metallic. Density readings are off the charts, yet the material composition is anomalous. Before I could respond, a wave hit me. It wasn't physical. There was no impact, no sound in the control room. Instead, the sterile hum of the Aetheria vanished, replaced by the dry whisper of wind through sandstone. I wasn't in the control room anymore. I was standing on cracked earth, the air thick with dust and the scent of parched rock. Above me, not the steel ceiling of the Aetheria, but a sky bruised with the last light of a dying sun, painting a desert canyon at twilight. The air was cool, carrying the faint, earthy smell of millennia. My boots, the heavy, reinforced ones I wore on excursions, felt solid beneath me, yet I knew I was still strapped into my chair. It was a phantom sensation, vivid and utterly real. A sharp, collective gasp ripped through the comms, tearing me from the illusion. The desert canyon at twilight shimmered at the edges of my vision, fading like smoke. My head snapped up, my eyes refocusing on the main view screen. The image was distorted, flickering with static, but what it showed was undeniable. The drill's camera, designed for pinpoint clarity, struggled to resolve the object it now faced. It wasn't rock, not metal, not ice. It was a structure, impossibly vast, stretching beyond the camera's wide-angle lens. Its surface was a tessellation of angles and planes that refused to sit still, shifting subtly, defying the very laws of perspective. It was non-Euclidean geometry made manifest, a nightmare carved from some unknown, light-devouring material. My own hands trembled as I typed commands, trying to stabilize the visual feed to make sense of the impossible. Run full-spectrum analysis, I commanded, my voice strained but firm. Deep scan, material composition, structural integrity, everything. The data flooded in, a flood of impossible numbers. My screens glowed with readouts that made no sense. Density readings fluctuated wildly, oscillating between near zero and figures that suggested a collapsed star. Material composition came back as unknown, non-baryonic, inconsistent. There were no atomic signatures, no discernible crystal lattice structures. It was as if the data itself was recoiling from what it tried to describe. The energy output, it's not thermal, not gravitational, the chief engineer reported, his voice tight with bewilderment. It's something else, a resonance almost, and it's affecting our onboard systems, minor power fluctuations across the secondary conduits. I ignored him, my gaze fixed on a particular data stream, the structural integrity report. It showed the drill bit still lodged against the impossible surface, vibrating with an unseen energy. And then a series of subatomic readings blinked into existence. Not an energy signature, but something far more insidious. A psychic echo. It wasn't just affecting our sensors, it was subtly, irrevocably, touching us. The phantom scent of parched earth and the cool kiss of twilight lingered at the back of my mind, a ghost of a memory that wasn't mine. I felt a subtle hum behind my eyes, a pressure building, not painful, but insistent. This wasn't merely a geological discovery. This was a breach into something utterly alien, something that didn't just exist in space, but seemed to exist between spaces, hinting at a reality far more vast and terrifying than I had ever dared to imagine. My determination hardened. I had to understand this, had to document it, before whatever this was consumed us all. The subatomic readings, those impossible signatures, had vanished as quickly as they'd appeared. leaving behind a cold vacuum in the data stream. I stared at the blank display, the hum of the main console a dull throb against my temples. It had been hours since the drill bit struck the anomaly, hours since the collective silence had fallen over the observation deck. Now a different kind of quiet settled in, a deep, pervasive unease that clung to the air like static. I found the lead prospector huddled in a corner of the common area, his face pale and drawn. He was tracing patterns on the condensation-streaked viewport with a trembling finger. The dreams, he mumbled, not looking at me. There. Vivid. Always the same winding path. They keep fluctuating. Readings are all over the place, but the physical components are fine. It makes no sense. He slammed his palm against the console, a dull thud. Just static, like the air itself is humming a discordant tune. I tried to dismiss their complaints, attributing them to stress and the isolation of our mission. We were on Xylos-7, a rogue world, hundreds of light years from any recognizable star. The pressure was immense, but the collective anxiety was a palpable weight pressing down on all of us. Even I, Reid Chen, the pragmatist, felt a peculiar tightness in my chest, a sense of something unseen observing us. It wasn't English or any language I recognized. It was a murmur, a soft, insistent drone just beyond comprehension. I paused, my hand hovering over the input tablet, straining to hear. Nothing, just the whir of the life support and my own ragged breathing. Just fatigue, I told myself, rubbing my eyes. But then, as I glanced up, a fleeting pattern shimmered in my peripheral vision, a complex tessellation of impossible angles, a geometry that defied Euclidean space. It was gone before I could focus, replaced by the familiar metallic bulkheads of our temporary habitat. My heart gave an uncomfortable lurch. Stress, I repeated, a mantra. Just stress. The next few hours were a blur of data analysis and increasingly unsettling encounters. The navigator reported his chronometer losing time, then gaining it, then displaying random sequences of digits. The lead geologist described waking with sand in his mouth, though he'd been asleep in his bunk, miles beneath the surface of a frozen world. Each anomaly, each strange report, chipped away at my rational defenses. I found myself back at the central console, trying to correlate the equipment malfunctions with the subatomic readings from earlier. And then the flicker. The metallic walls of the command center seemed to thin, to become translucent, revealing something else beneath. Not another room, but an expanse of raw ochre earth. The air, once recycled and filtered, suddenly tasted like dust and dry wind. My breath hitched. I was no longer standing before a console. The console was still there, but it was overlaid like a phantom limb, on a new reality. I stood on cracked earth, the ground sloping gently before me into a vast, silent expanse. The sky above was a bruised canvas of orange and deep violet, the last vestiges of a dying sun clinging to the horizon. It was a desert canyon at twilight. The wind, impossibly, whipped past my face, carrying the scent of parched stone and something else, something ancient and primal. This wasn't a memory. This wasn't a projection. This was here. My fingers, still clenched around the edge of the phantom console, felt the rough, gritty texture of sandstone. The geometric patterns, once fleeting, now etched themselves onto the very rock faces of the canyon, glowing with an internal, sickly light. They pulsed, shifted, reformed, each angle and line twisting into impossible configurations that strained the very fabric of my perception. This wasn't stress. This wasn't fatigue. This was a deliberate intrusion, a violation of my senses, a complete unraveling of my environment, something vast and ancient and utterly terrifyingly real. My determination, my scientific resolve began to crack. It offered knowledge, a boundless understanding, a release from the confines of my own flesh. But the cost, I could feel it, a subtle tug, a drawing of my very essence into the impossible geometry of the twilight canyon. I was no longer merely observing the madness. I was becoming a part of it. And I was terrified. The red dust of Xylos-7 swirled around my boots, kicked up by a phantom breeze that carried no scent, only the metallic tang of the planetoid itself. I stood at the edge of the designated survey perimeter, watching the last slivers of the distant, nameless star dip below the jagged horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges. This was the desert canyon at twilight, a place that should have felt alien grand, but instead felt like a tightening noose. The crew was different, not overtly hostile, not yet, but a pervasive, brittle irritability had settled over them like the dust. The comms officer, usually a fount of dry wit, now spoke only in clipped, necessary phrases, her eyes darting between the monitors as if expecting to see something other than data streams. The engineer, who once whistled tunelessly while calibrating the survey drone, spent his shifts hunched over his console, muttering to himself, his fingers tracing patterns on the cold metal. Even the cartographer, usually meticulous, had begun leaving his mapping equipment scattered. Once I found a delicate laser scanner left out in the open, vulnerable to the elements. I tried to engage them to rekindle some semblance of camaraderie. "Anything unusual today?" I'd asked the comms officer, gesturing vaguely at the alien landscape. She'd merely grunted, not looking up, and tightened her grip on the edge of her console. When I approached the engineer, he simply stared through me, his gaze fixed on some point beyond my shoulder before abruptly standing and walking away without a word. It was a silence deeper than the vacuum of space, a void carved out of shared experience. Their withdrawal was a physical barrier, isolating me even as we stood on the same ground. Back in my personal module, the hum of the life support system was a fragile comfort against the vast quiet outside. I pulled up my geological logs, a meticulous record of every rock sample, every seismic reading, every atmospheric anomaly since our arrival. My life, my sanity, hinged on these precise entries. I prided myself on their accuracy, the unyielding truth of data. I scrolled through the recent entries, specifically the data points collected after we'd breached the subterranean structure. My eyes snagged on a temperature reading from 3 cycles ago. It was off. Not by much, a mere 0, 3 degrees Kelvin, but it was off. I remembered logging that specific data point myself, double-checking it against the sensor array. It had been 273, 15K precisely. Now it read 273, 45K. A small detail, easily dismissed as a sensor fluctuation or a transcription error. But I never made transcription errors. A cold dread trickled down my spine. I checked another entry, a spectral analysis of a silicate formation I'd personally examined. The log described a faint trace of an unknown isotope, something I'd noted as peculiar but dismissed as a localized anomaly. Yet my memory insisted I'd recorded a strong trace, significant enough to warrant further investigation. The log now simply stated faint trace, unremarkable. My heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I cross-referenced the entry with a photographic scan I'd taken. The timestamp on the image was correct, but the metadata associated with it, the automated sensor overlay, mirrored the altered log entry. It wasn't just my text, it was the data itself. My hands trembled as I scrolled through more entries, finding other subtle shifts. A reported mineral composition subtly different, a seismic tremor's intensity scaled down, a date on a drone deployment shifted by a few minutes. Each alteration was minor, almost imperceptible, but collectively they painted a picture of a carefully curated falsehood. Someone or something was tampering with my records. I had to tell someone. Captain Vance. He was the only one who might understand the gravity of this, the only one who still held a grip on objective reality, I hoped. I found Captain Vance in the main command center, silhouetted against the holographic star charts, his shoulders slumped. The desert canyon at twilight outside the viewport seemed to press in on the habitat. He looked weary, lines etched deep around his eyes. "Captain," I began, my voice tighter than I intended. "I need to speak with you. It's about the logs." He turned slowly, his gaze heavy. "Reid, what is it now? Another anomaly? We've had enough of those to last us a lifetime." His tone was devoid of its usual command, replaced by a dull resignation. "No, Captain, not an anomaly. Inconsistencies in my own logs, small details, but they're altered. Temperature readings, spectral analyses, even timestamps. It's as if someone or something is subtly rewriting our history here." I held out my data pad, displaying the discrepancies. Captain Vance took the pad, his eyes scanning the highlighted entries. He frowned, then sighed, rubbing a hand across his temples. "Reid, I understand your concern. You're a meticulous man, but we're all under immense pressure out here. The isolation, the strangeness of this place, it gets to you. But these are hard data points, Captain, not subjective observations. These are measurable, verifiable facts that have been changed." My voice rose, betraying my desperation. He handed the pad back, his expression unreadable. "Reid, with all due respect, what you're describing sounds like classic space madness. Hallucinations, paranoia, a breakdown of objective reality. It happens. You're not the first to experience it, and you won't be the last." "Space madness." The words hung in the air, a bitter accusation. "You think I'm hallucinating my own data, that I'm imagining these changes? I think you're exhausted, Reid, overworked. You've been pushing yourself harder than anyone. Take a break. Step away from the logs for a few cycles. Get some sleep." His voice was gentle, almost paternal, which only served to infuriate me further. He wasn't hearing me. A wave of utter desolation washed over me. He didn't believe me. He saw me as just another crew member cracking under the strain. The very person I'd hoped would be my anchor, my connection to reason, had cut me adrift. I retreated, the weight of his words pressing down on me. Space madness. Was he right? Was I losing my grip? The thought was a venomous whisper in my mind. The meticulous scientist, the man of facts, reduced to a victim of his own mind. I was alone, truly alone, caught between a reality that was subtly unraveling and a sanity that felt increasingly fragile. The cracks had appeared not just in my logs, but in my very perception of what was real. The canyon air, thick with the scent of dust and something metallic I couldn't quite place, did nothing to cool the fire in my veins. The chief engineer's dismissive tone still echoed, a phantom insult in this impossible landscape. I clenched my jaw, the grit of frustration grinding against my teeth. He thought I was just tired. He thought I was breaking. But I was seeing, I was documenting, and they, it seemed, were merely succumbing. The twilight bled across the sandstone cliffs, painting them in hues of bruised purple and angry orange. It was beautiful, in a way that felt deeply wrong, like a wound made visible. The shadows stretched long and distorted, twisting familiar rock formations into grotesque, leering faces. I watched the other crew members, a small cluster of figures dwarfed by the sheer scale of the hallucination. The surveyor was muttering to himself, tracing patterns in the sand with a trembling finger. The comms officer was staring intently at a distant ridge, her face slack with a strange reverence, as if witnessing a miracle. My gaze settled on Marcus, the geotech. He was hunched over a battered data slate, his stylus moving with frantic, precise strokes. He wasn't looking at the canyon walls or the impossible sky. He was drawing. I edged closer, my boots crunching on what felt like loose shale, though I knew rationally it was the deck plating of our primary observation chamber. The disparity was a constant, jarring blow to my senses. Marcus didn't acknowledge my presence. His brow was furrowed in concentration, a fine sheen of sweat on his skin despite the illusory chill of the canyon. The screen glowed with intricate lines, a labyrinth of angles and curves that defied conventional geometry. They folded into themselves, extended into impossible dimensions, then connected back in ways that made my eyes ache to follow. It wasn't a map or a geological survey. It was something else entirely. There! The true structures, Marcus mumbled, his voice hoarse without looking up. The real architecture. I leaned in, trying to make sense of the tangled mess. What structures, Marcus? What architecture? He finally lifted his head, his eyes wide and bloodshot, but with a disturbing clarity. The ones beneath, the ones that hold everything. They're not Euclidean, Reid. They're not what we thought. He gestured with his stylus towards a particularly convoluted drawing that seemed to show a series of nested cubes, each face simultaneously inside and outside the others. This is a cross-section of a thought, a pathway. Just then the comms officer, who had been staring at the ridge, gasped softly, "Look, it's moving, the light." My head snapped towards the ridge. I saw nothing but the deepening violet of twilight, but Marcus, following her gaze, nodded slowly. "Yes, it breathes. It's like a pulse, a slow, ancient pulse." She pointed, her finger trembling. "Do I see the way it ripples through the rock, like veins?" I strained my eyes, trying to perceive what they did. The ridge was solid, unyielding rock, etched by millennia of wind and sand. There was no light rippling, no veins, yet the comms officer was now walking slowly towards it, her hand outstretched as if to touch something ethereal. Marcus, rising to his feet, watched her with a knowing, almost serene expression. "She sees it too," Marcus said, his voice barely audible above the phantom wind that now seemed to howl through the canyon. "The living stone, this wasn't just my own mind playing tricks, this was shared. A collective vision meticulously constructed by something unseen, unheard." The comms officer reached the base of the ridge and pressed her palm flat against the solid rock. A beatific smile spread across her face. So incredibly warm. Marcus walked over to her, his movements unhurried, almost deliberate. He placed his own hand next to hers on the rock face. "It welcomes us. It shows us the way home." He turned his gaze back to me, his eyes burning with an unsettling fervor. "I can feel it, Reid, if I just let go of the old maps, the old rules." He looked at my hand, then at the solid, unmoving rock. I felt a bizarre, almost magnetic pull towards it, a whisper in the back of my mind that promised understanding, warmth, release. My rational mind screamed in protest. This was a hallucination, a trick. But the conviction in their eyes, the palpable sense of shared experience, eroded my certainty like acid. I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to look away from the ridge, away from Marcus's unsettling gaze. My hand instinctively went to my data slate, my fingers fumbling with the stylus. I had to record this, every impossible detail, every shared delusion. If my mind was breaking, I would document its fracture. If reality was unraveling, I would be the last one to chart its descent. My determination was a fragile shield against the encroaching madness, but it was all I had left. The phantom warmth of the rock still clung to my palm, a memory that defied logic, a promise that mocked my senses. I squeezed my hand, feeling only the familiar clamminess of my own skin, the rough fabric of my utility jumpsuit. The quiet hum of the Aetheria was a thin, fragile thread holding me to sanity, but even that seemed to waver, deepening then thinning like a breath caught in a throat. I stood in the narrow corridor outside the main lab, the silence pressing in. My rational mind, the one I'd built my career upon, screamed for answers, for data, for anything that could explain the shared delusions, the temporal slips. But the whispers, the magnetic pull I'd felt towards that non-existent rock, were growing louder, more insistent. Then it began. A low-frequency thrum, a vibration that didn't come through the soles of my boots but resonated in my bones. It was a sound I felt, a deep guttural pulse that seemed to emanate from the very core of Xylos-7, traveling up through the ship's plating. The console panels lining the walls, usually a steady stream of diagnostic data, began to glitch. Numbers scrolled wildly, then froze, then dissolved into meaningless geometric patterns before reforming. "Communications officer?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the sudden guttural groan of the Aetheria. The ship wasn't just vibrating, it was shifting. I braced myself against a bulkhead as the deck beneath me seemed to undulate, a sickening wave that passed through the metal. Gravity lurched, a momentary sensation of falling, then snapped back into place, leaving my stomach churning. No reply. Just the rising, insistent thrum. I pushed off the wall, determined to reach the bridge, to see if the pilot or the engineer could offer an explanation, a solution. But as I moved, the corridor itself seemed to play a trick on my eyes. The familiar orange stripe on the deck, a marker for the main thoroughfare, stretched, then compressed, then stretched again, elongating the passage before me. I felt a dizzying sense of spatial distortion, as if the very dimensions of the ship were being toyed with. Each step I took felt like walking on a rubber band, the distance changing with every stride. My destination, just 30 meters away, seemed to recede, mocking my progress. My gaze snagged on something new, something that hadn't been there an hour ago. On the dull gray plating of the bulkhead, a faint, iridescent sheen shimmered. It was a cluster of spores clinging to the metal like dew drops. They pulsed with a soft, internal luminescence, shifting from a deep violet to an ethereal teal. They weren't just growing, they were vibrating, synchronizing with the low-frequency thrum that permeated the ship. The air around them felt different, thicker perhaps, or charged with an unfamiliar energy. I reached out a gloved finger, hesitating. This was beyond a hallucination. This was physical. This was real. The structure wasn't just invading our minds, it was manifesting, spreading its influence into our reality. As my finger hovered near the largest cluster, the bioluminescent spores pulsed with a sudden, intense burst of light. The thrum intensified, vibrating through my very teeth. The ship groaned, a deeper, more profound sound, like a leviathan waking from a slumber. And then the corridor vanished. The cool, dry air hit me first, carrying the scent of dust and distant petrichor. My boots, no longer on the cold metal deck of the Aetheria, felt the coarse, gritty texture of sand. The low, purple light of twilight painted the vast, sweeping landscape before me. I was standing in a desert canyon at twilight, the sky above a canvas of deepening indigo and fading orange, streaks of violet bleeding into the horizon. Towering rock formations, sculpted by millennia of wind and sand, rose around me, their craggy surfaces catching the last vestiges of the day's light. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of a dry breeze through unseen crevices. This wasn't a mental image, it was a full sensory immersion. And then I saw it. It wasn't natural. It was a perfect obsidian square hundreds of meters high that seemed to absorb the twilight rather than reflect it. This was it, the source. Not just a distant entity, but a presence that could project itself, could become an environment. My mind reeled. The structure wasn't just awakening, it was reaching, asserting its own reality over ours, blurring the lines until there was no distinction between the ship, Xylos-7, and this impossible desert canyon. A sudden, sharp lurch. The scent of ozone filled my nostrils. The cool air evaporated, replaced by the recycled metallic tang of the Aetheria. The sandy floor beneath my boots hardened into the familiar deck plating. I stumbled, slamming back against the bulkhead, my vision swimming. The corridor was back, the proper length. The light steady, but the bioluminescent spores on the wall were brighter now, pulsing with an almost frantic energy. Each beat a silent, resonant thrum that vibrated through the very floor. My breath hitched. The structure wasn't just a geological anomaly. It was a conscious, pervasive force, actively reshaping my world, twisting not just perception, but physical space. The shift from psychological horror to this tangible, environmental assault was a profound, terrifying leap. I was no longer battling my own mind. I was battling an entire reality, and it was winning. The Aetheria groaned again, a deep, mournful sound, as if the ship itself was screaming in protest, being torn apart from the inside out by something utterly beyond its comprehension. My determination, once a shield, now felt like a fragile membrane stretched thin and taut, on the verge of tearing. The quiet hum of the Aetheria was a thin, fragile thread holding me, or so I told myself. But the hum was fading, replaced by a dry whisper of wind across impossible rock formations. My eyelids fluttered, heavy, gritty. When they opened, the sterile gray of the ship's research bay was gone. In its place, stretching to a horizon painted in bruised purples and oranges, was a vast, ancient expanse. I was standing on cracked earth, coarse and unforgiving, at the edge of a deep, winding desert canyon at twilight. The air, despite its alien nature, felt thick with the scent of ozone and something akin to baked clay, a smell that had no business being here, light years from any world I knew. Jagged spires of crimson rock clawed at the fading sky, their shadows long and distorted, stretching like grasping fingers across the canyon floor. The silence was profound, broken only by the faint, distant call of an unknown creature, a sound that resonated not in my ears, but in the hollow space behind my eyes. This wasn't a memory, it was a projection forced into my mind with an intimacy that felt like violation. I forced my attention back to the console, a desperate anchor in the swirling unreality. My fingers, trembling, hovered over the holographic interface, the data streams flickering with static. The canyon shimmered at the periphery of my vision, the twilight deepening, pulling me in. I focused on the raw sensor readings from the non-Euclidean structure, the scans that had initially baffled us with their impossible geometries. I needed answers, a weapon against the creeping madness. The data wasn't just numerical anymore. Mixed in with the energy signatures and exotic matter compositions were patterns, complex and recursive, that defied conventional interpretation. They pulsed, shifted, and reformed like living algorithms. They were ancient, profoundly alien, and yet I felt a strange resonance with them, as if they were speaking directly to a part of my mind I hadn't known existed. Each glyph was a miniature labyrinth, a fractal design that seemed to fold in on itself, hinting at dimensions beyond my comprehension. They were not static images, they were impressions, psychic echoes embedded within the very fabric of the structure's data. With each pattern I deciphered, or perhaps allowed myself to understand, a new layer of meaning unfolded, not in words, but in a surge of pure, unfiltered thought. The entity wasn't merely an inert structure. It was a consciousness, vast and ancient, a mind that had transcended the confines of physical space. It was dormant, or perhaps merely waiting, a silent leviathan slumbering beneath the barren surface of Xylos-7. The glyphs depicted cycles of cosmic dissolution and rebirth, of beings shedding their corporeal forms to merge with a grander, more fundamental reality. The desert canyon at twilight, I realized with a jolt, was not just a vision, it was a memory of its own, or a representation of its primal awakening. The twilight was its dawn. The glyphs weren't just a record, they were an invitation. Understanding its geometry, the impossible angles and infinite folds, was the key. It offered an escape from the corporeal limitations that bound me, a promise of ultimate knowledge, a merging with its vast, transcendent awareness. The desert canyon was no longer at the periphery. It was all around me now. The console, the ship, my own body, they were fading, becoming translucent. The crimson spires of rock seemed to hum with the same resonant frequency as the glyphs. My mind screamed in protest, but a part of me, a small, weary part, found the idea exquisitely appealing. To shed this fragile form, to escape the pain, the fear, the struggle. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the edge of the console, the cool metal pressing hard against my palms. It was the only thing grounding me, the only tangible proof that I still existed outside the impossible twilight of that alien canyon. The entity wasn't trying to kill us. It was trying to absorb us, to incorporate us into its own boundless existence. And it was offering a price that, to a mind already frayed at the edges, was becoming increasingly difficult to refuse. The entity wasn't trying to kill us. It was trying to absorb us. My breath hitched. The air, though recycled and sterile, tasted of dust and cold stone. When I opened my eyes, the console was still a console, but the viewport beyond it was a swirling tapestry of ochre and bruised purple. The light that spilled into the room wasn't the ship's artificial glow, but the dying embers of a sun I'd never seen, casting long, wavering shadows that stretched like grasping fingers. I was in the desert canyon at twilight. It wasn't a hallucination anymore. It was my reality, overlaid, inescapable. A sound, a low, guttural hum, drew my attention away from the impossible vista. It wasn't the ship's usual thrum. It was deeper, resonating with a frequency that vibrated in my teeth. I pushed away from the console, my legs feeling heavy, as if I were wading through fine sand. The floor beneath my boots felt gritty, not metallic. I followed the sound past what I knew were crew quarters, now appearing as cave mouths carved into sheer rock faces. The hum intensified, leading me towards the comms array. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the haze of unreality. The comms, our last link. The comms station, usually a brightly lit, sterile chamber, had transformed. Jagged, obsidian-like rock formations jutted from the walls, their surfaces slick with a faint, iridescent sheen. Thick, segmented cables resembling fossilized root systems snaked across the floor and up to the main relay panel, which now pulsed with a sickly violet light. And there, amidst the chaos, was Marcus. He was hunched over the main conduit, his back to me, his hands a blur of motion. He wasn't using tools, he was tearing, ripping at the braided cables with his bare fingers, the plastic insulation shredding like dry skin. A low, rhythmic chant rumbled in his chest, a language I didn't recognize, yet felt ancient and profoundly wrong. "Marcus!" My voice cracked, thin and reedy in the vastness of the canyon room. He froze, then slowly turned. His eyes, once sharp and analytical, were now wide and vacant, reflecting the violet glow of the panel. They held that same twilight I'd seen in the impossible landscape outside, a depth that swallowed light and reason. He didn't sound like Marcus. It was deeper, layered, like two voices speaking at once. "You hear it, don't you? The song, it's calling us home. What are you doing?" I tried to keep my voice steady, but a tremor ran through me. "You're destroying the comms, to the fading echo of a false reality. It's all static, Reid, noise, the true signal, it's here." He gestured wildly at the pulsing conduit, then pressed a bloody palm against its surface. "It speaks to me. It tells me to shed the skin of deception, to sever the threads that bind us to the illusion." My mind reeled. He was gone, completely. The entity had consumed him, twisted his logic into this horrifying devotion. "Marcus, stop. We can still get help. We can still..." "Help," he laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "There is no help. There is only understanding and freedom. Don't you feel it, Reid? The release, the dissolution." He took a step towards me, his movements jerky, unnatural. "It's beautiful to be unmade, to become part of the greater truth." He lunged, not at me, back towards the comms panel, his eyes fixed on a bundle of fiber-optic cables that glowed faintly. "The last thread," he muttered, his fingers scrabbling, "must be cut." I knew with a sickening certainty that if he severed that, we would be truly lost. No signals in, no signals out. Just us and the entity in this endless twilight canyon. My body moved before my mind could fully process it. I tackled him, throwing my weight against his back. We stumbled, Marcus letting out a surprised grunt, and crashed against the rock-like console. The impact sent a jolt through me, and for a terrifying second, the ground beneath us seemed to shift, the very air around us thickening. Marcus thrashed, surprisingly strong, his limbs flailing like a marionette's. He was muttering, chanting, his focus still on the cables. His hand, slick with blood, reached out, scrabbling for purchase. "Let go, Marcus!" I yelled, trying to pin his arms. He was fighting with a desperate, unthinking strength. A wild kick caught my shin, and I cried out, momentarily losing my grip. He saw his chance. With a guttural roar, he twisted, pulling away from me, and slammed his shoulder against the main conduit. There was a sickening crack, like bone snapping, and a shower of sparks erupted from the damaged panel. The violet light intensified, then flickered wildly. Marcus screamed, a sound of pure agony and ecstasy as his body convulsed. He was caught in the arcing electricity, his form illuminated by the blinding flashes. His eyes, wide and staring, met mine for a fleeting moment, and in them I saw not Marcus, but the vast, indifferent expanse of the twilight canyon. A final, convulsive shudder racked his frame, and then with a sharp, final pop, the lights on the comms panel died. He fell a dead weight onto the gritty floor. The air crackled with the smell of ozone and burnt flesh. Silence descended, thick and suffocating, broken only by my ragged breathing. I scrambled back, my hands trembling, my mind screaming. Marcus, gone, not just dead, but utterly erased, his body a husk, his mind consumed by the thing that had invaded our reality. The last link severed, I was alone, truly, terrifyingly alone in the desert canyon at twilight with only the hum of the entity for company. My heart was a frozen stone in my chest. The entity had shown me its destructive power, its ability to twist and break the minds of men. And I was the last one left standing, for now.